Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I again to welcome you to the special scientific panel seminar of the Union of African Population Studies, the panel on family planning, sexual and reproductive health and rights. So today, we have our moderator in person of Dr. Nuruddin Al-Hassan. Dr. Nuruddin Al-Hassan is a researcher with AFIDEP in Malawi. Dr. Nuruddin Al-Hassan, how is Malawi? So I want to welcome
Malawi
you
is
to
fine.
take
Good to see.
over from now. Thank you. Happy to have
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Akani. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to the last webinar for 2023 in the series of webinars organized by the UAPS panel on FP and SRHR in collaboration and with support from the Gates Institute at Johns Hopkins. We are grateful to the team there for supporting this. Today we have a very interesting presentation by a leading scientist, an African scientist who has achieved so much, and it's a privilege to be able to introduce him. I'll introduce to you Professor Alex Ezeh, who is leading today's presentation on divergent demographic experiences in the 21st century, implications for low and middle income countries. Professor Ezeh is a global health professor at the Dornsife School of Public Health, Drexel University, and his work focuses on urban health, population change, and models to strengthen knowledge-based institutions, particularly in Africa. He previously served as the founding executive director of the African Population and Health Research Center in Kenya, guiding it to become one of the foremost research institutions in the continent and globally. Prof. Ezeh serves on several international nonprofit boards, including the UN High-Level Advisory Board for Economic and Social Affairs, and currently co-chairs a new Lancet Commission on Adolescent Health and Well-being. Prof, I have the privilege to invite you to lead the presentation today. Your presentation, we have 45 minutes, so hopefully we can take the first 30 minutes for the presentation, and we have about 15 minutes for question and answer session. Thank you, and over to you, Prof.
Thank you, my brother Nuruddin. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for joining us today, wherever you're joining from. Some of you may be wondering, what has divergent demographic experiences got to do with family planning and sexual and reproductive health and rights? For one, I think there is no doubt that family planning is one of the most significant global development interventions in the last 50 to 70 years. The WHO defines it as one of the best buys. And when you think about it, it has been one single factor that has been very instrumental to changes in maternal and child health. It has freed women from the tyranny of reproduction, allowing them opportunities to gain access to formal education and formal employment. And overall, we've seen this, that even in poor settings and in rural areas, when family planning programs are made accessible, women tend to use it. And when women use family planning, fertility drops. And we've celebrated the decline in fertility as having contributed to the current trends we see, especially in high-income countries with aging, which we celebrate as a human achievement. We are living longer, healthier lives. And so that's really thanks to family planning. And as we look at these trajectories of what's going on with population change, I think one of the things that we would need to pay attention is that the experiences that we have in Europe and high-income countries may not be applicable to the experiences and the trajectory that many low and middle-income countries are on. And that's what I want to focus on in the presentation today. So I will draw for this presentation largely from the World Population Prospects, the 2022 revision, which is produced by the UN Population Division. And this provides global population estimates from 1950 to the current period, 2022, and projections to the year 2100. And I will look at this. I will use this data to show how the experiences of low and middle income countries when it comes to population issues may be quite different. To start off with, I just want you to look at these 5 points. I would not focus on the first. I thought it's a question that you would hopefully be able to answer at the end of this presentation. I will also not talk about the last, which I think is another question for you to consider in the throughout this conversation. And maybe we'll have some time to discuss them and what they mean for us going forward. But I will look at divergent population trajectories in different regions and what that really means. And then building on that, think about how do we look at population decline beyond aging and the pension systems and the care economy that's really dominated the conversation around population decline. I would then try to end looking at the limitations that may exist with the current UN population projections and what that might mean for low and middle income countries as we go forward. So 2022, when this new revision of the UN population projections, prospects was released in 2022, if you look at where the country has been, where the countries and the world has been since up to that point, one of the things we would know is that right from the time of Malthus to the current period, you can think about Paul Ehrlich's population bond, we have been concerned with issues of population growth. But the concern has particularly been more with population growth in poor countries and largely in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia in many parts. And so that concern is still there today, particularly when we think about the fact that the global population, currently at 8.1 billion, will add another 2.3 billion by the end of the century, or before it starts to decline by around mid-2080s. And most of this growth is going to happen in Africa. Actually, Africa will grow by another 2.5 billion people, which is larger than the global growth. And we will talk a little bit about those. But if you think about the rate of growth of these populations, I think about the countries that are growing fast. And by fast, I've taken a growth rate of 0.69%. At 0.69%, what that means is that the population of that country or whatever geography that is growing at 0.69%, it will take that country 100 years to double. And the doubling time of 100 years is seen as manageable in many ways. And that's really what characterized most of the growth in Europe over the centuries. And so that's a defining point that one can look at and say, okay, if you're growing at that rate, it's not excessive. As of 2022, there were 131 countries that were growing at that rate. By 1950s, almost every country in the world had growth rates over those. It was over 220 out of 225 or 236 countries that were included in these projections. But what we would note from this is that if you continue to look at the blue line, by the end of this century, there will be only 3 countries in the world that will have growth rates of 0.69% or higher. And those 3 countries will be Niger at 1.01%, Senegal at 0.75%, and Mayotte at 0.85%. All these countries are in Africa. For the rest of the world, what we are seeing going forward is actually a different dynamics altogether, with the number of countries that are experiencing negative population growth currently at 41. It will continue to grow, and by 2100, 154 countries will be experiencing population decline. So that's the future we want to look at. While we recognize that the issues of high population growth rate has not been resolved, and there are reasons to be worried why for the countries that are still struggling with rapid growth, like you think about the West and Central Africa and some parts of South Asia, if you think about these places and say, okay, how do we ensure that we finish the agenda of ensuring that women have the resources they need to achieve their desired family size? As countries, there are many reasons to expect that for these countries may actually face a different challenge. For one, we might feel that the population growth problem is over, because at the global level, the rate of growth has really dropped significantly. It's about 0.8 now. Very soon, it will be getting to a point where we really should not be concerned and worried about the growth. So that could then mean that attention will shift to other issues, and it is already shifting to these other issues. But we might also see not just the fact that for many countries that are facing population decline, which are largely countries that also invest in family planning programs or donor countries, they are already looking at ways they can stimulate population, higher fertility in their countries. And there might be ethical issues and questions regarding to how do we ensure that the fact that we can adopt domestic policies that promote fertility is consistent with supporting family planning programs in settings where they're still experiencing very rapid growth of their population. But the other might be the fact that if you project all the way to 2100, you see that Africa will have the largest share of working age population. And for many, they see that as a positive thing for the world, because then we can continue to supply the labor that is needed in places with declining population. And so for whatever reason it is, the point remains that for a country like Niger, where the growth rate is about 3.7% or 3.8%, that means every 18.5 years, this country doubles its population. For a country like that, to be able to double within the 18 years, the stock of educational and health and jobs and housing and everything that is needed to sustain these poor levels of coverage of these services is almost impossible. So what will be the future for a number of these places? We do understand exactly the challenges of rapid population growth. And I just want to see, as you see currently, how many of the countries in the Sahel region have had military coup recently. And I've made a point that it does not matter whether we have a liberal democracy or a dictatorship, a military dictatorship within these countries. The growth of this population will continue to challenge central administrations in these countries to be able to meet these basic needs of the people. And that will remain a challenge. So I would want to move forward to really look at the other side of population decline and what's going on there. So there are at least 3 basic reasons to expect that the trajectory of population decline in low and middle income countries will be very different from what it has been in high income countries, and particularly in Europe, North America, and Australia and New Zealand. If you look at those regions together and you compare their experiences, what we will see in low and middle income countries will be very different. The 3 factors relate to the pace of fertility decline, and then the role migration is playing. And the third point is what I call reverse momentum for growth, or the momentum for decline. I would then spend a little bit of time to look at the UN projections and how it might actually be understating the rate of change in low and middle income countries and what that would mean. And then hopefully talk about the implications of population decline and beyond aging and the care economy, what it could mean for different parts of the world. If you think about Europe's experience with fertility decline, you know, for France, it took France about 250 years to move from the peak of their fertility to below replacement level fertility. Fertility started to decline in France around 1700, but they didn't reach below two children per woman until around the 1940s. For the UK, their fertility started to decline around 1800, and it took them up to about 1940s to actually go below replacement level. For many countries, low and middle income countries that have achieved declines in fertility, they've been able to do that in matters of 2 to 3, in some instances, 4 decades. And here I show you an example of the UK, which is in blue, and Jamaica, which is in red and orange. The solid line is just showing you the total fertility rate, which is the average number of children per woman. You can see the decline in the UK is much earlier than that, except for the blip that you see in the 1960s. But for Jamaica, by 1965, the total fertility rate was about 5.7. By 2005, it has actually dropped below 2 children per woman. What is really more important is to pay attention to the projected fertility rates in the two countries. The UN projects that total fertility rate in Jamaica and the UK will be between 1.4 and 1.6 over the remainder of this century. So it's not really, it's not different from each other. They are pretty much having similar rates of growth or similar levels of fertility going forward. But when you look at the broken lines, you see the rate of change in the population of the UK and Jamaica. While the UK remains at about 0% rate of growth, Jamaica will be declining by the end of this century at 3.3% per year. At 3.3% per year, it means that the population of Jamaica will drop by 50% every 23 years. So you can also think about, what does this different rates of change mean for the two countries? I show from the UN 2022 revision the population pyramid of Jamaica and the UK in 2023, which is on the left, and in 2100. As I mentioned, the population of UK will actually increase from 67 million to about 70 million between 2023 and 2100. Remember, they have pretty much the same level of fertility. For Jamaica, however, would drop from about 2.8 million people to about 890,000 people, a 70% drop in the population of Jamaica. So while population decline can be couched as aging in the UK and with limited consequences for the population, for a country like Jamaica, it is not just about aging. It is a consequential change in their population going forward. One of the other points, I can talk about one of the things that drive this change here, and I talk about the rate of decline of the population, and I will come a little bit more to that in a moment. But the other thing is migration. I think many of the rich countries have been able to implement policies that allow younger people, often with higher fertility, to move from their countries in search of better opportunities in these places. And that has actually become a major strategy that sustains the population at levels that has not created much shifts. And I'll talk a bit about that. The second point I made is the fact that if you think about Niger that I talked about and the rate of growth there, is there a possibility that the projections that the UN generates it actually understates the actual rate of growth? And one of the ways you can look at this is to see the UN has been producing these projections since the 1960s, and you can look at previous projections to see where is Niger projected to be by 2022, and where is Niger? If you compare the 1996 revision in green, the projection for Niger, it's actually projected that the population of Niger will be around 19 million by 2022. If you look at the 2022 revision, it estimated the population of Niger in 2022 at 24 million, which means Niger's population in 2022 is at least 24% higher than it was projected to be just in 1996. You can also compare the 2010, which is the first time the UN projected the global population to 2100. And every subsequent revisions of that projection provides a larger number for Niger than the previous ones. And what does this mean? Simply means that Niger is growing faster than it is being projected to grow. Already, you know by the projection that it is doubling every 18 years, which means that actually the population may be doubling in less than 18 years in terms of their experience. So my preliminary analysis suggests that the major driver of this type of change in a place like Niger is the effect of age at first birth. Globally, age at first birth is around 26 years. In Niger, it's about 18 years. And many other countries, including Bangladesh and Mali and Mozambique and many Central African Republic, it's under about 18 years. If you think about a country that is having a mean age at first birth is 18, and you compare it to another country where the mean age at first birth is 30, if you looked at a period of 90 years, in the one that has 18 years of mean age at first birth, you have about 5 generations of people. And in the one with 30, you have 3 generations of people. So even if fertility and the age structure and the population size of these two countries are exactly the same, and remember, you can actually have a very low mean age at first birth with very low fertility. In a place like Bangladesh, their mean age at first birth is about 18 years. Fertility rate is about 1.8. In Ireland, fertility rate is about 1.8, 1.7, 1.8, and age at first birth is about 32. So it does matter that you can actually have these influences differently. But what it means then is that in the places with very low ages at first birth, you will have more generations being born in that population. I think it makes common sense, but we need to be able to accommodate that within our modeling and projections of global populations and country populations when there are huge differences in age at first birth across countries. But more importantly, I also made the point that in places where the population is declining, the projections may actually also understate the rate of decline of those populations. And I use the example of South Korea to illustrate this. Every single projection shows that the population of South Korea is declining faster than it has been projected to decline. Even when you compare the 2019 revision, which is in blue, and the 2022 revision, that's a period of 3 years, thereabout. There is a 24% difference in the projected population of South Korea by 2100. So what is it that is driving this change? Of course, one would be the age at first birth, which is very high in South Korea, at least 32 years. But it may also be something to do with what I'm calling reverse momentum for growth or the momentum for decline, which is the fact that when a population or a country experiences a very rapid decline in its fertility, it actually changes the age structure of that population from a pyramid to an inverse pyramid, or what I call a funnel. And what happens and what you see is that we know momentum for growth because momentum talks about the fact that when you have a very high rate of population growth, you have a base that is much broader, and there'll be more people every year coming into the childbearing age than those leaving the childbearing age. So because of the increase in the number of women giving birth, even if fertility is declining, it is not enough to compensate for the increase in the number of women giving birth. So the number of children being born continues to grow. Well, you can also have the reverse, where because of the sharp decline in fertility, you get in South Korea by 2000, a very defined shifting of the age structure, where every new cohort of children being born is smaller than the ones ahead of them. And over time, what you then begin to see is that this shifts the age structure significantly, that it becomes a major driver of future population trajectories in these countries. Let me give you take you back to basic demographic models that we use. You see, when you look at the demographic transition and the models they create, they actually do not anticipate that populations will decline to such a point that you have an effect like reverse momentum. So if you see in the last place here on the right, that's the typical structure. And this is the European experience. It's almost coming to a stationary population where the rate of growth is 0 and almost every age group is the same. And that population continues to maintain itself. This is the model we have. But when you look at the experience of South Korea, you realize, and this South Korea is not unique. You can look at Thailand. You can look at many other countries that have achieved very rapid rates of decline in their fertility, and you see patterns like this. I want to make the point that what is driving this is not fertility decline or low fertility. The major fact here is the change in age structure of the country. In 2000, there were 13.4 million women of childbearing age in South Korea. Currently, there are 11.4 million people of childbearing age in South Korea. By 2100, there will be 3.4 million women of childbearing age, 15 to 49, in South Korea. So even if fertility is to triple amongst this population, it will not be enough to compensate for the decline in the number of women giving birth. So the UN actually projects that the population of South Korea will increase by almost 83% between now and 2100. We know that we are not there because the 2023, the population, the total fertility rate in South Korea is still declining. It's about 0.78 now. So, but it's projected that it will already have been increasing by now. So it is not the fertility, because if you actually then account for the actual fertility impact that we see in the country, then the projections that I have given you of the number of women and the number of births that are occurring in the country will be much lower than what is there. I also made the point that the third point I made is that the fact that the effect of population decline, particularly in low and middle income countries, is beyond aging and the care economy. You can look at East Asia and you look at the sex ratio for young people, say 10 to 24. This is a known factor there. Now, there is about a 15% deficit of girls to boys in that age group in this region. And the question is, what does that do to the marriage market, for instance? How do we think about urbanization in the context of population decline? What happens to educational systems in urban areas and housing? Vacant housing is a major social issue in places like Spain and Italy and Japan at the moment. So these are broader questions that, thinking about population decline, we need to be able to look at those importantly. But currently, the models that we use and we have applied does not allow us to look into this. I want to, let me move forward and talk about what this means, and maybe we can open it up for conversations. So when we think about how do we respond to this demographic future, one of the first important points to note is that the European and high-income models of population change are inadequate for low and middle-income countries. Not only is it that their fertility took hundreds of years to decline, to move from the high levels to below replacement, while it's taken many low-income, middle-income countries now less than 40 years to do that. They are able to draw in immigrants who are much younger, and that actually has kept the population buoyant. In poorer countries, they will not have that privilege and opportunity to do that. And while they do not have the opportunity to bring in immigrants, they're also facing emigration of their young people in search of better opportunities in high-income countries. So that's why their fertility will decline, their population decline will be much faster. And when it declines much faster, it changes the structure of that population in very defined ways that then sustains the continued decline in those places. So when we talk about negative population growth, I think we need to be able to go beyond aging and the care economy, because the implications are much broader than aging, particularly for low and middle income countries where this may be an existential issue. The diversity of demographic experiences will call for an honest and well-reasoned approach to addressing both continuing growth, rapid growth in some regions and rapid decline in others. We need to be able to have the framework and the mechanism to discuss these things in ways that ensure that we are able to understand the implications of both and address them. But more importantly, I think there is need to invest in research to fully understand population decline globally. If you think about South Korea, the president recently made a point that the country has spent $200 billion in the last 16 years to increase fertility, but they've achieved, now the fertility continues to go down. What is the policy approach in South Korea? They provide large financial incentives to families with children under age 1. Well, these people already have a child. And it takes more than the first year if you have a child to actually take care of a child. It's not just the first year. What if you think about other approaches that a country like South Korea could adopt? For instance, make female labor participation compatible with childbearing. It's like you, as a woman, you're forced to choose between your career and family. And if you are faced with that decision, the choice is simple. You go with your career. With your PhD, you don't just want to have one child and two children, and that's the entirety of your life. You want to continue to pursue, and they pursue those approaches. What if you change the roles that men and women play in childbearing so that men have as much responsibility for childcare as women do? What if we think about ways where if you're a single woman in South Korea and you want to have a child, that it is normal and acceptable to do that? So there might be many other things that the country could consider, but we need to be able to invest in research that understands and explores these sets of issues within that context. Paul Mullen recently wrote about the need to tax childless couples and individuals in the UK as a way to stimulate higher fertility. But do we know that that will actually work? What if the reason young people are not having children is the fact that they can't afford to give to their children the same type of life they had growing up? What if instead the policy is about providing decent housing for young couples or providing childcare for young couples? How would that affect their decision and the timing of first birth? And we know that when you delay the timing of first birth, you actually increase the rate of decline of the population. So the field of demography and the world needs to pay close attention to population decline. That's really the point here. And that the experiences that we have built around it in terms of healthier and longer lives applies to Western countries, but not necessarily to low and middle income countries. Our experiences will be very different. And it is important that we begin to pay attention to these things to fully understand what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ezeh. I think that was a great presentation. And I'm sure you all do admit that he raises very pertinent points related to even the models that we use. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions, comments. I see we have some senior colleagues. I will not mention names, but I'll first go to the first question from Henry, Doctor, which is to get your thoughts on the consideration for future revisions in the projection models.
Okay.
You made a case of models, so maybe you can take that first, and then we invite other questions.
Thank you, Henry. It's good to hear that you're here, and it's a pleasure to get your question here. I think I've been discussing with the UN Population Division on the need to at least look at age at first birth. You know, people confuse age at first birth with age at birth. If you look at age at birth, for many countries, it doesn't really vary much across countries, because in low fertility settings, women have children later, which is around 28, 29, 30, 31, but they have a child and they stop. In high fertility settings, women start early, like say 15, 16, 17, but they continue having children up to their 40s. So when you look at the mean age at birth, it's around 28 across the board. So it doesn't matter. But what matters is when do you start? If you start early, then that affects the gap between the generation of mothers and daughters. And when you project forward, then that's what really matters. So that's one basic thing that could be change that could be made. The second point of change that could be made in the projections is to think about the UN currently did the 2022, they did provided 85 and 95% confidence interval around the median variant. You know, before what they used to do is to create the median variant, and then around that they see what if fertility is half a child higher or half a child lower than is been projected to change. What would that be? And that gave you the low variant and the high variant. Now, there are a lot of issues. If you think about that, and you think about a country like Niger, half a child increase is about 7% of their 6.8 children TFR. In a place like South Korea, half a child is almost like more than 50%. It's like 67% of their 0.8 children per woman that they have now. So the possibility of fertility changing by that magnitude is almost impossible. But the fact that it can change by more than that in Niger is very possible. But now, when you look at the 95% confidence interval and you look at a place like Niger, it produces by 2100 a range that is statistically relevant, but practically meaningless, because it says by 2100, the population of Niger could be anywhere between 70 million and 570 million. That's a 500 million difference in that projection. If you're a policy maker, a minister of planning, how do you actually work with that? So what if we change those and say, okay, what we want to look at is, what if in Niger, the fertility drops by one child, or the fertility drops by 15% or by 20%? What would that mean? A 20% drop could be 1.2 children. And this is what that trajectory would be for this country. But if you use a percentage drop, then that's something that you can actually target. I know we don't like targeting in demography and all that, but if you said you want a 10%, then that is built off a base of your total fertility rate currently, and then you can project that, and that would be more meaningful to each country, because your rate of change, even though we are using the same proportion, but the implications in terms of the actual fertility or the number of children that is implied will be different depending on your fertility levels. So there are a number of things that could be done, but the key thing is to see that, and I know that the UN is thinking about this, the population division is thinking about this and looking to see how best to implement this, but there's definitely a lot of things that could be done to improve the estimates.
Thank you. We have another question from Alex. From Daniel. I think he's talking a bit more about the relationship between age at marriage, age at first birth, and then its implication on TFR. Just teasing out the issues of fertility preference in terms of the numbers. Structurally, does that change? I'm just trying to interpret the question.
Well, I don't think I fully understand the question, but why I think about age at first birth rather than age at first marriage is that in many places, particularly if you think about Africa, premarital childbearing can be quite high. And so when you limit it to marriage, you may, and also the connection between marriage and childbearing is changing in many places. In fact, we talk about the decoupling of marriage and sex. Marriage and childbearing. That's it. So before, it used to be that you marry, you have a child, but now that relationship is no longer as strong. So if you think about it, there are many people who are married and do not have children or do not want to have children. And so using age at first marriage really does not, would not help you get a more precise measure of the implications of that for fertility and for population change going forward. But if you use that age at first birth, what it does is actually concretely measure the change between generations, and that's what you want to model.
Yes, and he's saying that is the fertility preference really in many countries is higher than the replacement fertility for those countries. And looking at the influence of people's preference for children, why is it that we are still projecting declines across?
Okay. So we know that in many low fertility settings, yes, preferences are higher than actual fertility. And the reason is, why are people not meeting their preferences? If you think about it, I think the data suggests that for some of these people, it might be that they actually want to have a child, they cannot have a child because of primary or secondary infertility, and that could be a factor. For the others, they want to delay. They want to wait, and the longer they delay having it, maybe becomes fertility forgone if you continue to delay it at a point where you can't really have it. Others want to have, but they want to have it under certain conditions. They want to have a partner that they can raise a child with, and unless that partner comes around, they're not going to have the child. So there are many reasons why preferences do not materialize. But if you then want to use the higher preferences, you still have to be able to make adjustments for what actually happens, because population growth is not driven by preferences, it's driven by actual fertility and other factors. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but that's really the reason why we pay more attention to the fertility, because preferences are not always realizable.
Yes, thank you. So there's a question on, I'll just read out two questions so that you take them together. The first one is the socioeconomic impact of these projections. The question is, are there sub-Saharan Africa countries that need specific attention? And also in terms of following up with targeted interventions with specific measures? And are there lessons we can draw from what we already have for those countries? The second one has to do with the factors contributing to the fertility decline in the different contexts.
Okay. So if I take the second question first, what factors? I think we do know many factors that contribute to fertility decline. One is female education, and that has been very established in many different contexts, in low fertility settings, in high fertility settings. Think about it, when women finish primary school at age 13 and they don't go to secondary school, what are the other options available? You marry, you start having children. If you finish secondary school at age 18 and you don't go to university, what are the other things? But if you go to school, school has been seen as the social intervention that actually delays entry into marriage and childbearing. So that's something that's definitely very important factor. The other is greater opportunities to participate in the formal workforce and all of those. And the availability of family planning now. I think, why did it take Europe hundreds of years to move from very high fertility to below replacement? Is that the methods available were really not there then. So people used all manner of the traditional methods that they could afford then, but now we have the opportunities. You can have a child and decide to have sterilization, and that's where you end the childbearing. There are many other things that you could do now. So the means to achieve your fertility preferences is more available now than it was historically. So these are many different reasons why we have these changes and declines in fertility. In terms of sub-Saharan African countries and that would need special attention, of course, if you think about it, there are about, I think, 30 countries in the world today where the total fertility rate is at least 4 children per woman or higher. All those countries except Afghanistan are in sub-Saharan Africa. So in these places, if you think about the countries where rate of growth of the population is still 3% or higher, meaning that the population is doubling every 23 years or less, all of them are in Africa. You're thinking about Somalia, you're thinking about Niger, Mali, Central African Republic, Mozambique. There are many countries, South Sudan, and all of those. So at these rates of growth, really, life will get harder and tougher in many of these places. And we have to be honest about that.
Thank you. So there's an important question that has come in here, which is challenging given that the European models, right, which are formed, may not necessarily align with the dynamics of low and middle income countries. Doesn't this prompt us to ponder what should form the foundation of population models for these regions? Which pivotal factors must we consider in this endeavor?
Very important, absolutely. And I think that's what I'm trying to say here. We need to be able to look at age at first birth in these places, because in places with very high rates of population decline, age at first birth is very high. In places with very high rates of growth, age at first birth is very low. We need to look at the population structure and momentum and see how do you factor that in, both reverse momentum and shifting structures of the population. We need to be able to take those into account. There are a lot of things that we can do. And I think as we look at the model, is to really move away from the thinking that population, you think about the phases of the demographic transition. And when you get to the post-transition phase, it's almost like a parallel line that goes infinity, where mortality and fertility are pretty much similar and equal. We don't anticipate the fact that actually fertility would drop below replacement significantly, and age structure of the population would change significantly. And these forces would create a new phase of the transition that is beyond post-transition. We need to find the language for that. And we need to be able to model that and demonstrate that these things are important drivers of the future of the future demographic trajectories in these countries.
Okay, so we have two more questions here. So there are thoughts from Conrad, and his thoughts are considering talking about the capability of African governments to consider population as a resource. Based on your experience, is it possible to propose incentives like we have elsewhere to reduce fertility in these countries? And what are the returns from that type of investment? I know there's a lot of work on that, but you can talk of it. And then the second question, if I may, is do we really want to keep the same priority for family planning across the board? And how does this sit with the rights-based approach for SRHR?
Okay, thank you. If I don't remember all the questions, please remind me. On the second point, the second question, if I can respond to that, I think one of the biggest, we have to acknowledge that we've made so many mistakes in the population field over the years. And one of those mistakes is really the abuses that came in, even with some family planning programs in many settings, and the targeting of poorer people and people of color and minorities in different geographies and countries. And as we look into countries with very rapid decline in their population, we have to ensure that whatever approaches that are taken do not repeat the mistakes of the past. I think there's been recent evidence of China taking a different shift from its one child, two children policy now to actually trying to get women to see childbearing as their responsibility for the state and for the country and all that. And there are reports now of programs like vasectomy being taken off the shelf, and in hospitals and all that, they are no longer providing those. And so you might begin to see in countries where the push to have high fertility and to increase fertility could lead to some other abuses. And we need to pay attention to that and not repeat the mistakes of the past. That's one point. The other is to, so the first question, maybe you can remind me again what the first question is. You're muted, sorry, Nurdin. Nurdin, you're muted. I can't hear you, you're muted.
Sorry. So the first question is whether we can really incentivize governments in Africa with similar programs that we have elsewhere on fertility reduction.
Sure, thank you. You know, you go and read the Africa We Want, Agenda 2063, and you look at what is the point that it's made with population. Actually, I think the word population appeared like 4 times, and it is not used it in the terms of population size and population growth and all that. It's really, it's almost zero thing there. And we have not prioritize that. People talk about whether there'll be 40% of the global population being African, sub-Saharan Africans and all that. And people are concerned what with that. And for me, I keep making the point. It does not matter whether we are 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion, or 6 billion Africans. the question we have to always ask is, what quality of Africans would those be? Are they going to be educated, healthy individuals that are contributing to the development of Africa and the rest of the world? Or are they going to be dying, trying to cross the desert, Sahara Desert, and the Mediterranean Sea to get into Europe and all that? I think the policies we adopt now, we are better off with 3 billion highly skilled, educated Africans with the human potential capitals being fully achieved than 6 billion that have no impact in the world. So, and our ability to achieve that may be directly proportional to the rate of growth of our population. When we are growing very fast, it becomes very difficult to invest enough to achieve the health and educational opportunities children need to thrive. And you did not talk about nutrition and jobs and all of those things. So that's really, we need to have that conversation amongst ourselves as African countries, as African governments, as African scholars, as African demographers. We're having the next population conference in Malawi, and we need to be able to put these issues on the table. And I feel that we really cannot make progress with things as they are. We're already beginning to see the handwriting in many different places. And it is challenging. And we need to be able to have a voice to say that at this rates of growth, we really cannot make progress. But achieving that rate of growth then means that, say, what is the ideal? And that's something we don't know. And even when you know that, how do you achieve it? Because fertility is driven by 1 billion individual actors having sex on different times in places. And, but you can't influence what all these people do in their spare time. But overall, are there structures, are there policies, are there investments that could be made that would then make that goal possible? For instance, how do we ensure that women have access to education beyond primary and secondary level, at least up to secondary level? How do we ensure that unmet need for Africa in Africa is still for family planning is not at 24% or 23%? That we're able to, women who want to delay childbearing have the means to do so. How do we, so these are the types of conversations that we need to have. And when you have the system in place and the policies in place, then we can begin to achieve the progress Malawi is making, Rwanda is making, and different other countries are making in Africa. We can see how do you extend that across the board to many of the countries in the Sahel, and maybe that will give us the space to then begin to think and say, how do we then begin to build from there? You're muted again.
Yes, so there's a question about the efforts to increase fertility in South Korea and the UK, and what your thoughts are in terms of the impact of these policies on the principles that we've often espoused in SRHR, the rights-based approaches. And do we have a way of addressing these rights-based questions in the midst of trying to increase fertility?
Well, I mean, in many of the places, and the South Korea and the UK are not the only places. You think about Hungary and Sweden and Norway, and they are looking at different options and policies, and they are trying to implement different things, including, I think Hungary is given 4 years. No, if you have the 4th child, you get lifetime exemption from paying taxes, for instance. In other places, they are doing this. But I think in many places, what has really seemed to work, and this is a place like Sweden and Norway and others, is making child care services more accessible to couples and to people, to women with children, so that it's more, I mean, raising children is not just buying diapers in the first year. You're thinking about a 22-year commitment, a 24-year commitment to get them through university. You're thinking about sending them to the university here in the US, $40,000, $50,000 a year, $70,000 a year. I mean, the cost of education is something else. And in many of these places, so these are real challenges. The policies so far have been, have not had the elements of coercion, except the examples I've given before, with certain services being withdrawn and not being offered and all of those things. And who gets affected the most by those, like in a place like China and all that. But across the board, most of the places where they've implemented these policies, it is there for those who would want to do it. And if you think about South Korea, they're only giving it this incentive to those who already have children. So if people decide to have children because they want that, that's a different decision they are making, but they are not being forced to do that. So what's my view on that is that I think countries would have to think of policies and right-based policies that may be able to incentivize childbearing. But one of the points I make, and I continue to make, is that it is very easy to motivate reductions in fertility, because in many places, women want fewer children than they actually have. So if you make family planning available, they will use it. It's much harder to incentivize women to have children. And the 200 billion in South Korea with limited resource gives you an insight into how hard it is to do this. But we need more research to understand what is it? What are the policy options and the policy instruments? And like I talked about in South Korea, that maybe the policy option should be changing the orientation and create social programs and TV programs that promote joint child rearing for men and women, that promote career prospects of mothers, and that you can be a mother and still be a career woman, and that's acceptable. So some of these things, but it goes against traditional norms in those places. And we need to be able to recognize that those norms are failing. And unless things happen differently now, the trajectory is not going to change.
Okay, thank you. I think we are getting to the end. I have one last question from the chat, which is a methodological one. There are several others that I've not taken because I think they are similar to some of the points. And then I'll ask my question. So there's a question on taking into account the trajectories of women's educational attainment and how we factor that into the accuracy and reliability of future population projections. There's a question on your thoughts. How accurate will these projections be given the trajectories of women's education? And my question has to do with migration. And you made a point that one of the 3 key areas we need to focus attention on is the impact of migration in low and middle income countries. Are you foreseeing a situation where low and middle income countries will make a claim for compensation because the young workforce is actually emigrating to developed countries and they are not getting returns because of future population declines in those countries? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nuruddin. I think you saved the most important questions for last. And my point here is, in terms of projections, I think, there are 3 main population projection models that exist pretty much. One is the UN population projection, which is by far the most robust because it covers all countries and regions and territories and all of those things. We have the Ezeh, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, Austria, that Wolfgang Lutz and the team leads, which factors in changes in education profiles of countries over time and what that means for the projected rates. And then we have the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington that also produced projections, and where they factored in other things like family planning and education and things like that. When you take all of these together, what they actually do is to look at the things that affect fertility levels. And when you factor those in, then you get a different structure of how the fertility will behave going forward. And that's a major driver in these projections. The point I've made about age at first marriage actually works outside of those. It looks at how soon are generations being replenished within a population. It's almost like a very direct effect of age at first marriage on population change. And the other is indirectly through its effect on fertility. So all these projections are looking at how does it affect the cost of fertility going forward? And it is very important that we bring all those in, because we need to, the beauty of projection is the more closer it is to what the anticipated future realities are, the better it is for policy purposes and for planning purposes and all of those. And the more accurate and you know that for the next 20, 30 years, the projections are pretty much similar and very, but when you go into long-range projections of 90 years or more, then these begin to make differences and impact, and the level of confidence on those begins to widen, the confidence interval begin to widen. So I think it is important that we pay attention to those and make it, because they will only increase the efficiency of those projections going forward. With migration, I think it's a very important question. And if you ask me, I'll say that, okay, first of all, the migration policies in many high-income countries, they are policies because they have very specific goals and targets. Look at the diversity lottery program in the US, or the skilled workforce, Canada's new policy on immigration and attracting skilled workforce and all of those. They are targeting very young, educated people and all that. And in many instances, you're in Malawi, you know how many Malawian doctors work in the UK, and Nigerian doctors that work here in the US and all of those. So the point is that the attention has been focused more on the informal immigrants that may be striving to go through the boats and come into Europe and other, but not the ones that are actually being courted and incentivized to move. And it's not just the West doing it to attract young, educated people from poorer countries. Even our own governments are offering scholarships for the best of our minds, the best graduating high school students in Malawi or in Nigeria may get 20 scholarships to study overseas. And we know that they are not coming back. And in a global knowledge system where the knowledge economy is driven by really investments in human capital and what comes from, from our intellect and all that, when Africa continues to lose the best of its people, its competitiveness in the 21st century will be highly undermined. And that's something we don't talk about. And so the question you ask with migration, in fact, I'd say that it's not going to be a far-fetched. Currently, what we see is that countries building walls and closing borders. Maybe the next phase of the migration question and battle will be poorer countries, low and middle income countries, closing their own borders from allowing young people to live. And because ultimately, for a place like Jamaica, there is no future without such radical policies. But then that brings in the question, what does that do to human rights, the freedom of movement, and all of those things? So there are real issues that needs to be addressed. And my sense is that by raising these questions, then we can begin a conversation on how do we ensure that these things are addressed in a more humane and rights-based approaches. But if we leave it there and ignore it as we've done over these many years, then we will begin to react when these things become real and people begin to take such policy options going forward.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think this has been an interesting discussion. We are over the time by 5 minutes, and it's because there are too many thought-provoking questions, and you raise so many issues with implications for research, our methodologies, and even in terms of our development policies, how we go forward with them. I would like to thank you so much for making time for this presentation, and to thank all those who participated. We had at a point over 90 people joining the link and listening in. And to thank our colleagues at Johns Hopkins for the support, Molly, Kelly, and as well as the UAPS Secretariat, Sylvia. Thank you so much for putting this together. This is the last webinar for 2023. Hopefully we can have the next set of announcements available for 2024 and to have this. Prof. Akani, do you have last few words?
Yeah, because it's just again to thank Professor Ezeh. Thank you for this thought-provoking presentation. And we are hoping that this is part A. I think, again, we are pushing it to Professor that next year, we will give you another slot for the part B of this. Thank you so much for this very insightful presentation. Again, to thank all our participants and also our sponsors. As you rightly said, this is the last for this year. We want people to have good holidays in December. So in January, please don't forget the last Wednesday of January. Again, we will continue the conversation. Again, to thank everybody, and especially to thank Alex and to thank our support from Hopkins and the Secretariat. Thank you so much. So, Professor Alex, I don't know if you want to say goodbye to everybody. So that.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure, and for everybody, thank you all for joining and for participating in this.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Merry Christmas, everybody.